aspirants said solving this will be like solving ordinary crimes.
Kung ano yung capability ng mga corporates, yung mga ginagamit yung social media platforms para makapanira, mag-spread ng fake news, ganun din ang capability ng dapat ng law enforcement.
Teach as a fact, importante na may katotohanan, mayroong basihan yung iyong itinuturo, hindi po pwedeng based lang doon sa iyong personal na pananaw o maging impluensya ng politika o yung kapaligiran mo.
The dissemination of false and misleading information and fake news, these are all getting heightened as the campaign heats up and leading to the elections 3 months from now. The most vulnerable to disinformation, young voters. How can institutions and the public protect election integrity? We discuss in this episode of The Chiefs. Welcome to The Chiefs. I'm Robbie Alampay. With us online, Lucy Cruz Valdez of News 5 and El Ligao of One News. Chiefs, good evening.
Hello, and
Happy Thursday.
Well, we had late breaking news on the the decision of the first division of the COMELEC, basically dismissing the petition to disqualify Ferdinand Marcos Jr.
And that's interesting kasi, well, basically naman kasi the arguments are similar to, and the facts were similar to the ones
first
presented
one.
to the second division, which was dismissed last month. So basically they were working with more or less the same facts and the same arguments.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, this is not yet over. Kasi meron pa yung, so mag-a-unbank, and then we anticipate, baka abutin pa hanggang Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court, yeah. And I think there's still another case pending for disqualification with the second division.
Yeah.
So there's still some, meron pang leftover
Ilan
cases.
ba yan? Parang 4, di ba?
I'm not sure how many are left in
Hindi
the
ko alam.
second division.
Pero itong dinesisyonan division, this is already a consolidated case of 3 different petitions. But in any case, I think naririnig naman sa tono natin lahat, it's not like anybody's surprised by this. This is something that Rowena Guanzon was also trying to flag and actually was desperately trying to, what shall we say, at the very least,
Call attention to.
Call people's attention to.
Interestingly,
Although, Robbie, you will remember na, she said that she thought that Commissioner Casquero
that's true.
was also voting to disqualify, and that may have been the reason daw, at least in her mind, di ba? Kung bakit pinapatagal
That's
yung
right.
decision.
That's a good point.
Well, it appears she's wrong.
Kasi 2-0 to. Casquejo voted with Ferolino, both voting to dismiss.
yeah, but it's also interesting to point out that Casquejo and Ferolino were the originals of the first division, and they voted on
First
this.
division.
But beginning today, si Socorro Inting takes over the first division.
That's right. Casquejo moves to the
Casquejo
second
moves to the second
division.
division, where he will now decide on the remaining case with the second division.
Okay. Well, anyway, siguro, this is obviously we're going to unbundle this in subsequent conversations. But tonight, we talk about fake news, misinformation, disinformation. We're speaking with Professor Rachel Khan, who is the project coordinator of Check.ph. Professor Khan is also with the UP College of Mass Communication. Good evening, Professor Khan.
Good evening.
Prof.
Good evening.
Good evening sa inyong lahat. Yes.
Hey, Prof, actually, I wanted to fact-check something that I just said at the introduction because we said, who's the most vulnerable to misinformation and fake news? And we read out young voters. But I remember just a few years back in the earlier studies of fake news, ang findings no na actually hindi eh. It's the titos and the titas and the lolos and the lolas and your papas and mamas who are more
Who have
vulnerable.
no familiarity with the digital landscape.
Di ba? But bumaliktad na ba yun? Is it still the older people who are more susceptible to fake news, or tama ba yung binasa ko that it's actually the younger people now?
It depends because right now I think all age groups have their vulnerabilities. With the young set, it is very difficult to determine fake news kung naka-TikTok. So dun sila ina-address ng mga nagdi-disinformation. Dun sa mga apps that are harder for them to check or easier to believe because it's a quickie. So I think that's where the young people are getting caught.
In which case, it's platform-based vulnerability. Kasi
Yes.
the platform also dictates how lengthy or comprehensive the material is, and whether it can be treated shallowly or deeply.
Right. It serves to echo something that's already there. So it echoes the disinformation that has been presented in long form, either in YouTube or Facebook posts. But then it embeds in the person's subconscious. And as the saying goes, no, a lie repeated often enough sounds like the truth. And I think this is the motto of our disinformation authors.
Pero si Rachel kasi
Right.
teaches eh. So I suppose you interact with a lot of young kids. Unlike us, we don't have that much exposure to them anymore. So you interact with both the young and the old. I'm wondering lang if you can give us an idea of how it is, yung distribution ng ng vulnerabilities between the young and the old. Off the top of your head, sinong mukhang mas nagugoyo?
Siyempre, yung ano pa rin, yung mga hindi ganun ka-savvy sa technology.
So,
So I
matatanda.
think it is still the older group
Yung mga wala
in
sa TikTok.
general.
Oo nga, no, Ed?
Wala tayo. We're not implying anything.
I feel alluded to.
Of
but
course not.
yes.
I was alluding to Rachel. Sorry.
I think it's because most, older people, titos and titas and lolos and lolas, na ako na yata yun lahat, parang we're not on social media as much as the young, no? Which also shows in a way that, sabi nga nila, di ba, yung mga, kasi sa broadcast, mas marami ang mga mas matanda na nanonood ng TV ngayon kesa sa mga bata. So in a way, is it safe to conclude na though they are more vulnerable to fake news on social media, on the whole, because their source of news information is still broadcast and print, no, that they're also less vulnerable. What do you
Yes.
think?
I think because they have alternative sources of information that gives them a chance to hear the truth and verified news. The problem now, the recent study of media use is that social media, Facebook, has taken over even radio. So it becomes very worrisome that majority
true.
of the information is now through social media, which is easily manipulated.
But Rachel, I mean, yung Check.ph, and people, if you want to go to it, it's Check.ph, and if you want to, of course, help out in this. But I know you're monitoring, you're reporting on the situation, but I guess the real question for people is, okay, so what do we do? Even without diving into the details of your findings about how pervasive and how unavoidable and how powerful fake news is right now, the real question is, so what are we supposed to do?
Well, I think these days we have to have a fact-checking state of mind, not to believe in everything right away that we hear, especially if the source is just through social media. There's a need to double-check our information. The thing is, most people don't have that habit, and that's a habit that we are still trying to build in people. No? So, although mag-improve naman over 2019 when we were talking about this back then, I think more people are aware of even the notion of fact-checking, which was a sort of a very alien term back then. So, in just 3 years ago. So, I think more people are more conscious. At least that's what I'm hoping.
What's the indicator for that?
Yeah.
That things are improving?
Well, for one thing, there are more fact checkers. When we were starting Check.ph in 2019, we still had to convince newsrooms that fact checking was now something that should be ordinary in any run of the newsroom, of any school, that they should have something like this. When we were forming Check.ph in 2022, in inviting more members, most universities had already immediately agreed. The ones we invited, they already knew what fact checking was, and they already saw its importance. So it was not very hard to build the team this time. And we have now a group of 34 fact checking organizations with Check.ph. It's something that we could not have achieved in 2019.
But how do you measure response to items that have been fact-checked? I mean, I just wonder if it even matters to people that certain items they read might have been wrong. And do they actually get back to it and check out whether that item that they just read is wrong? Because ang napapansin ko ngayon, Prof, is there's so much going around in chat groups. They pick up something from social media and then they blast it in their chat groups and it goes around. Even if it's wrong, and News 5 has been kind of like a victim of that, no? Parang we feel like nobody really says, "Ay, mali pala yun," and we have no idea whether it was indeed acknowledged as wrong,
Yes, I know what you mean. I guess there's still a learning curve with most of the public. But the fact is that most of our organization members have followers, different from each other, different sectors, is something I think is positive. That means more people are, looking at their pages, checking verified, or looking at verified information. At the same time, now the problem is, it's not just the disinformation per se, but the fact that they're using social influencers to spread it. In many times, what's happening now, or one of the things that we observed is, for example, a pre-existing Facebook group on, let's say, Filipinas cooking, right? So suddenly it was supposed to be all about food and sharing recipes, and then suddenly it's a presidential candidate's platform. They even changed the name. So how did this happen? And all the members of that group are suddenly caught unawares that the group that they had joined about cooking is now a political platform. And this is one way of when they share it with that in that platform, then of course it spreads faster, because many members who don't check on a daily basis don't realize na nagagamit na pala sila.
Hey, Rachel, if I could be direct about it, I know you didn't mention any presidential candidate. That could be for two reasons. I mean, one, maybe you just want to be fair and not name anyone. On the other hand, it could be universal. Maybe all presidential candidates are benefiting from that kind of a practice. But let me be direct about it. Is there a particular campaign? Is there a particular candidate to which you would ascribe this campaign, or at least, let's say, benefiting from this kind of strategy?
We haven't really gotten all the statistics yet, but the more obvious one, because even without statistics, we see it happening, is the campaign of Bongbong Marcos. So we've seen Facebook groups changing their names and suddenly having that moniker, or being part of their network.
Okay.
Oh,
okay, can you tell us exactly how Check.ph works? Because we know that there are many fact-checking organizations already. Pero so far, di ba, merong mga, alam ko, puntahan ng mga ako, tsaka karamihan yun pa rin mga Snopes and especially for news abroad. But here in the Philippines, halimbawa, where do I go if I want to see whether a particular story is true or not? Is your website, does your website check a different group of, information from, say, other fact checkers, like, I don't know, Vera Files has its own, Rappler, I know, has its own, and a couple of other fact checking groups here. How does it work, at least for Check.ph?
Well, Check.ph is a collaborative effort of several fact checkers. So we invited those that have no political leanings to join us. So one of the things, one of the requirements is that it's non-aligned. And then it's a mix between academic, civic society, and media partners, where each one actually works independently. And then what Check.ph does is to collect and collate the fact checks of all our members so that it becomes like a repository of fact checks. So the public, if they want to check that information, they can actually just go to our site and check and search it for fact checks that are already done. In fact,
Okay.
we have categories where they can just look. For example, they want to look at a particular candidate. They can search all the fact checks done in that particular candidate, or a particular issue. Let's say the West Philippine Sea. So they can also search that and just look at what's been done in terms of verified information.
So you're election focused.
Yes. Check.ph
Uh-huh.
only looks at election-related fact checks. So when we started in 2019, we only existed during a month after elections.
I
And then
see.
after that, we retain the archive, so you can actually go and check, compare 2019 to this year. And we're doing the same this year. So we're gonna basically only look at election-related posts.
So okay, so far, how is this election looking like compared to 2019 in terms of the fake news going around?
What we see is that there's more disinformation going on and a lot of rehash disinformation. So many times it has come out, let's say, in December. It comes out as something new again in February. So even our fact checks are kind of repetitive sometimes because there's a new angle to the same old uh, fake information, right? So what we're seeing is a lot more activity, and one good thing is there are also a lot more of us to tackle the growing number of disinformation. So every day there's something new, and there's always, at least now we're able to post more fact checks on a daily basis because there's more of us also working.
Okay, we're speaking with
So,
you're speaking with Professor Rachel Khan of the UP College of Mass Communications. It's also of Check.ph. But Prof, pasensya na, we just need to take a break. We'll pause right here. Please stay with us. The Chiefs will be right back.
And welcome back to the Chiefs on One News. We continue conversation with Professor Rachel Khan, the project coordinator of Check.ph. Prof, I'm sure you're aware that there are people who are fact-checking the fact-checkers. There are people and groups who claim that the fact-checkers are themselves, without naming the fact-checkers, are themselves not particularly objective. They side with a particular candidate, and that they only focus on one or two specific candidates. How do you address that criticism?
Well, they can say that, but basically, we're trying to be as neutral as possible. But of course, if there are more disinformation coming out from one particular area, then naturally there are more fact checks in that area. So it's not about the number. It's not about siding with anyone. So it's depending on who is creating fake news, and that's what gets verified, and that's what gets fact checked. At the same time, we are discovering a few fake fact checkers, and I think that people have to be aware that there are some Facebook pages and groups that claim to be fact checkers but are not, and you can trace that by looking at their fact checks. It's not trending. One of the things that we look at in Check.ph are trending fake news. Kumbaga, nagte-trending siya, kaya namin kailangan i-verify para
kumakalat na.
hindi maloko ang public, no? But in this particular, let's say, fake site, they create their own fake news and then they pretend to correct it. Tapos dun mo lang makikita, you can't find it anywhere else on the web. So you know that they're not real. But, they're, and mostly they're attacking a particular candidate or several candidates. They have targets. So, yeah, if you look careful enough.
We certainly recognize and acknowledge the need to counter the disinformation and misinformation, to fight fake news. But and we certainly admire your effort. But sa lahat ng kinukwento mo, doesn't it feel like you're constantly just putting out grass fires all over the place? Where is saan natin hugutin yung hope? Ika nga, when, as you said, paulit-ulit lang yung fina-fact check namin. Yung lumabas ng December, alam namin lalabas ulit yan sa Feb. Okay, so we have to recast our, and then now there are fake fact checkers. Also,
right,
that you also have to counter. So it all seems to feel like a spiral, or we're all in the middle of a typhoon, or whatever metaphor you want to throw out there. But where do you get the proposition that this is not a hopeless battle?
First of all, we know that it's a David and Goliath fight. But we're here for the long game, meaning that our existence makes people aware of the need to fact check. And what we hope is to help put people in a fact-checking state of mind and to build media literacy. That is the long game here until we get people to be aware of the existence of false information and how they are fooled. So, we don't really expect to be able to win this battle at this time, but we're hoping to make a big dent on fake news until we really find a solution. And I think worldwide it's a problem that has to be addressed. It's something that has been talked about in the UN, the Council of Europe. So we're in it for the long haul.
They're becoming more and more creative. I have to say, I came across a quote card that seemed quite credible, but it was so outrageous in its claim. And then at the very bottom, in very, very, very fine print, it said something like courtesy, sarcasm. So in a way, it was claiming that, hey, this is not real, but in the way it was laid out, it really looked real. And the worst part was they used our logo. That's why I can't forget it. That's how creative they have become. Do you I just wonder how you, as Robbie said, no, how you even monitor stuff like this, and if it's something you even need to correct because by its own admission, it has a disclaimer, although it's in fine print. Does that fall within the purview of what you do in Check?
Yes, that could have been a satire. One of the things that's happening is that something that is really posted in a satire site, which is supposed to make us all laugh, people lift out of the satire site and then they take it out of context. So they remove the authors. So you don't know that it actually came from a satire site. And then they present it as fact. So that's where the fake news comes in. The original authors had no intent to fool, but the ones who distribute it do. So that's another problem that is circulating.
Pero kasama ba yan sa trabaho
Kasama
niyo?
yan sa
Hindi even-
kasama siya sa disinformation. That's one of the types of disinformation actually.
Prof, let me squeeze in one last question before we let you go. We belong to a generation, I say we kasi kasama ka doon kasi nagkasama pa tayo, nasa business world ka dati.
Right.
We belong to a generation that relied on newspapers, television news, and radio news. But speak to us about that and the shift to the digital and the social media as sources of news and how that affects or how that impacts the vulnerability towards fake news.
I think the advantage nga of, as you said, our generation is that we are not digital natives. So we are in the transition group. That gives us the edge of knowing how to determine or, better sourcing of our information. Now the problem is teaching the next generation how to be more critical in the choice of their sourcing of information. And this is where the challenge is. If they're, they forget that in social media, there are algorithms that lock them into their own echo chambers. And that's something that we have to keep on reminding people so that they don't think that they have a world view when actually they have a very narrow view of the world because they get their news from social media. That is something that should be part of media literacy training from grade school. And that's, I think, the challenge of education now.
Okay. Professor Rachel Khan, the project coordinator of Check.ph and also from the UP College of Mass Communications. Prof, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank
Ingat
you
po.
also.
Thank
Maraming
you,
salamat
Prof.
po.
Good evening.
And now joining us is Professor Jonathan Corpus Ong, who is the disinformation researcher. Parang mali ata, who researches disinformation with Harvard and the University of Massachusetts.
Tawagin niyo si Professor Khan, nandito yung salarin.
Check.
Professor Jonathan, I'm sorry for that. Well, at least na-correct namin ng maaga. But thank you for joining us. Sir, I think you're muted.
Hello, sir.
Are you? Yeah. Okay. We're good. Professor, thank you for joining us. I understand you're in the East Coast, so may time difference tayo, but you still bothered to join us, and we appreciate that. Professor, you of course have authored several studies and papers on disinformation in the digital age. But speak to us about how the Philippine digital landscape has changed, and as well how Philippine behavior has changed, and what makes it vulnerable to disinformation. Di ba? Sa pagbabagong ito in the last 5 to 7 years, how have we become more vulnerable to fake news?
Yeah, I find it quite paradoxical now for this election cycle. There seems to be a lot more fact-checking going on. Civil society, journalists, academics are more prepared. At least we have definitions and terminologies that 6 years ago, bago pa lang sa atin yung fake news, disinformation, all of these are new terms. But at the same time, the paradox is we are also bewildered and overwhelmed this time around. We're still kind of unsure. The questions that Lucy posed earlier to Professor Khan, does fact-checking even work? So there's this sense na parang gumagana ba itong interventions natin ngayon. So I think what we're seeing for this election cycle is yung cumulative impact of 6 years of discrediting mainstream media, of vitriolic speech from politicians, and of course the public na madali din silang na confuse. There's always new platforms that are emerging as well. So there's always like new threats that are emerging dahil hindi pa natin na-address yung underlying infrastructure, yung mga tao na gumagawa talaga ng fake news and disinformation. Kaya palaging may bagong iteration, may bagong version of fake news.
Professor, how do you address that infrastructure? I mean, are there any particular low-hanging fruits in terms of intervention? I don't know. Are you speaking by law? Are you speaking education system? I mean, what goes into that infrastructure?
Yeah, so as an academic, parang we're all about a whole of society approach to fighting disinformation. So ibig sabihin nun, lahat tayo may responsibility. So hindi lang yung educational system, hindi lang yung ating teachers. Parang I often hear that na parang yung mga kabataan kasi ngayon hindi nila naranasan yung martial law, hindi sila naturuan ng tama. They didn't learn their history properly. It wasn't taught properly in school. But it's not just the teachers. It's also not just you folks in journalism. Everyone should be involved. Definitely lawmakers should be involved. I'm not entirely sure, however, that the best regulation is being proposed right now. I still think na parang they're going after, as you say, low-hanging fruits rather than understanding and spotlighting the people who actually are profiting from disinformation. And I think that's the kind of research that myself and colleagues have been doing. Ini-interview actually namin yung mga operators behind political campaigns and also of these fake accounts. And I think we still need more understanding as to how it actually works. Paano ba sila nababayaran? And to create disincentives around that, to make it harder to produce fake news in the first place. Of course, yung fact checks kasi they try to catch fake news once it's already circulated, once the conspiracy has already traveled. And I think that's important to do still, but that needs to be complemented with other monitoring approaches.
Professor, as they always say, diba, you have to worry about what you can control. You mentioned a lot of players, a lot of stakeholders in this entire ecosystem of information and disinformation, but you didn't mention the platforms themselves.
Yeah.
Yung platforms, is that something that we should consider is something that is within our control, or is that something that we put on the category of that's out of our control?
Yeah, I think we should definitely be engaging platforms much more aggressively. So what we're seeing right now with Facebook, and it's often also just Facebook that we talk about, but definitely we need to engage Twitter, but also other platforms like TikTok, messaging apps like Viber. What are their policies for content moderation? What are their misinformation and disinformation policies? So definitely we need to be engaging them in terms of transparency and accountability. So for this election cycle, a bagong introduction ng Facebook is yung advertising library nila. And this is an attempt at transparency. It's an attempt. It's an incomplete attempt, right? Like how they have gathered and also narrowly defined what they mean by digital advertising. Na-collect nila on a platform that you and I, anyone can actually go onto their portal and see the official spends on Facebook of the different political campaigns. And so that's important, but I think we definitely need much more robust monitoring. They need to also be more transparent whenever they take down certain posts. I think we're always worried about might this harm free speech? And there's always that very difficult balancing act that any regulation should be very worried about that. Any attempts to compel platforms to be much more robust in their content monitoring and their deplatforming, hindi dapat ito makaka-harm sa free speech, particularly of dissidents and those who are critical of the political elites of the moment?
Ako, Jonathan, ang tanong ko very basic, no? Because this is what my friends who are in the same generation as I am ask me a lot about, no? How exactly can you tell whether what you're reading is fake? Because it's many times I have to say I don't really know how to answer it except to find out what the source is, no. And if it's one of the networks or news organizations you're familiar with, it is most likely genuine. But I also know, and we've been a victim of this many times, that we have been faked, News 5, meaning ginagamit yung quote card namin using the same format, the same logo, and well, it's hard to spot, I have to say, unless you're from News 5. So what are the practical tips you can give to those who are most vulnerable to fake news on how to spot fake?
Absolutely. So I think you mentioned it, Ms. Tucci, source verification. Is this a reputable journalist who's sharing this information? Is this person trustworthy? One needs to scroll back and see the history of this, either a website or this Twitter account or Facebook poster. Is there a history of trustworthy content that we have shared? At the same time, we need to be trusting a little bit of our intuition as well. What does the story make us feel? Does this confirm our biases? Is it expressed in a way that is trying to trigger our outrage and trying to get us into to act in a very quick way to share this post? So parang pag medyo leading or inflammatory yung tonality or yung angle ng news, that's something that we need to be skeptical about. So I actually find quite helpful a lot of the resources that are being shared on Facebook, on Instagram, also on digital mental health, and yung parang practices of taking a step back from social media and having a very healthy media diet na you're not just exposing yourself to one kind of news or one angle of news. You want to have a very well-rounded media diet. And of course, when you see something that's been shared, and this has happened a lot during COVID as well, in terms of many kinds of fake cures, diba, that we were trying to search for in the time of COVID. Sometimes it's also not just the the fake account or the meme account, but sometimes politicians themselves, medical influencers who are trying to profit from it. So paminsan, it's also unpredictable kung sino yung nagsasabi nito, and that's why we need to be looking at, are other people saying the same thing? Can we see na parang, oh, it's confirmed by other more legitimate and more traditional news sites as well?
Pero Prof, let me drill down on that. Yung sabi nga ninyo, you need to make sure that the source is trustworthy. But at the same time nga, trust is a very relative and subjective thing. In one of your studies, you pointed out that more and more people are relying on influencers, people that they trust because they seem to be more organic, they seem to be more authentic, and all that. So it brings us back to square one. What do we do? Do we trust the people that we trust now, or?
Yeah, I totally get you. So parang right now, di ba, parang ordinary people, especially young people, we kind of respond to influencers who seem authentic, who seem organic, who speak to us in our own language, parang who can speak to us directly, di ba? Parang mixing in some humor as well with the political content. So yung understanding natin of what's authentic can be quite relative as well. So two things here. Again, the challenge that we're facing right now, and this has come up in your interview with Professor Khan. What happens when journalists or even the fact checkers are being fact-checked, are being undermined, di ba? Na what we're really seeing right now is an electorate that is really, really polarized. So unlike before na parang we were thinking, could the electorate be looking for someone medyo in the middle, someone to bridge us across our huge gaps, di ba? Na parang and try to have like a common conversation. But ngayon parang we seem to have different media universes. Like a multiverse. I think you had said that before. Na we gravitate towards information sources that only confirm our biases. And I think again that's a cumulative impact of all of this historical revisionism of the past 6 years, even longer. And that's why yung pag-build up ng infrastructure na parang okay, ngayon there's a YouTube ecosystem, parang buhay na sila, they've grown their followers over years and years, and they've become in a way trusted news sources na alternative from the mainstream media channels. And I think that's really challenging. So so the second thing here is I think we need to still be consistently trying to engage the other side. And I think that, as a researcher, I still find it important na hindi natin binablock yung other side. We still kind of know what they're talking about, ano ba yung sinishare nila, ano ba yung narrative nila ngayon, so that we can respond to it, we can open a conversation if it comes up. Kung may makasama kayo, a taxi driver, for example, like have a conversation. I know it's easier said than done, and I think we're still trying to develop a playbook of how to open a conversation with someone who seems to be resistant to facts. And I think that's been our challenge.
Professor, I want to attack it on the other side, not the people who are resistant to facts, but the people who are actually, in fact, resistant to fake news. People who are actually more information resilient, as I like to put it. We've been talking about ano ba itsura ng mga madaling nagogoyo sa fake news. We also ask ano ba itsura ng fake news. But I'm wondering, ano itsura ng information resilient na tao? Do we have an archetype? Is there a psychograph that tells us that beyond level of education, certain people tend to be more information resilient?
Yeah, that's such a great question, Robbie. We often kind of caricature, kumbaga, parang we often kind of jump at the idea of, the masa bobotante who might be vulnerable to stuff that they see online, that they don't know any better, they didn't have any formal education. Could they be more vulnerable to fake news and disinformation? So parang that's one of the easy assumptions that we tend to make. So, base lang sa mga studies, sa academic research, including my colleagues, Nicole Torato, Pete Argudes, for example, they say, and they critique itong understanding and assumption of the bobotante na kahit hindi nakapag-aral, we also tend to associate them, di ba, na the DDS or the BBM supporter. For example, nakita ko palang on Twitter kahapon, may mga videos na kumakalat about the people who attended the BBM, the Bongbong Marcos
Rally,
campaign sortie na yung nag-aagawan sila ng mga boxes ng mga
Tinapay.
ng mga tinapay, ng mga pamigay, and in a condescending kind of way as well. Yung parang it was being circulated in that way. So one might say na parang a lack of formal education might make someone susceptible, vulnerable to disinformation. But I think it's too easy of a caricature. It's too easy of an assumption as well. Parang naiisip ko lang din, parang going back to COVID examples, yung mga Tita of Manila Viber groups, di ba? Parang ang dami din nila medical misinformation, including yung mga groups circulated by my relatives, for example. So, hindi din natin alam and hindi natin
kaya ako natatanong because I mean, to your point, di ba? Parang lahat tayo nagugulat tayo, di ba? Yung kamag-anak ko palang ganun, parang ang dali palang mauto, ano? And now you realize na parang, meron pala ako mga kaklase dati na ibang klase mag-isip. And so, but let me take it to another level. We're talking about how overwhelming fighting disinformation is even right now. But there's another level pa to fake news. 'Di ba? Parang, in fact, we haven't even seen deep fakes really deployed. And this is really one of our biggest, this remains one of our biggest fears. Once we start seeing deep fakes deployed on video, on audio, on rich media, how much less prepared are we for that? And what are the bigger consequences there?
Yes. I think you're asking like predictions for the next generation of what will disinformation or fake news look like. So in terms of technological innovations, no, deep fakes are those videos na parang they're able to kind of use like CGI kind of technology. Parang 'di ba yung parang yung mukha ng ibang tao gets to impersonate other people, and therefore we need to train the right algorithms to detect that, and sometimes parang very again the higher difficulty of spotting what is real and what is not online. Kumbaga parang the matrix na hindi na natin alam what the kinds of visuals that we're seeing, right? And I think that's one threat. So the most recent use of a deepfake for a political campaign was in India. Kumbaga, yung politician na gumamit ng deepfake used a deepfake video of him pretending that he was speaking the dialect of a region that he was trying to win their votes for. So parang a positive deepfake, di ba? So sana naman wala pang ganun for this election cycle. Ngayon, what we still call cheap fakes, yung what Miss Lucy was saying earlier, yung mga quote cards na pinalitan yung quote or pinalitan yung mukha in a tribute to another person, yun pa din. So other worrying trends that we're seeing in global context is conspiracy theories and how parang conspiracy theories that insinuate various kinds of alliances of foreign actors with local players, obviously in foreign influence operations, diba, of China or Russia-backed fake account operators seeding posts in elections elsewhere. So those are things that we also need to be monitoring.
So how far away are we from literacy in terms of dealing with the information that we see on social media? Did the pandemic help, considering that many of us went online, for the most part during the pandemic, during the lockdowns? No, have you seen at least an increase or an improvement in social media literacy in terms of spotting fake news?
So I think what we're seeing that's quite new, and working with different civil society organizations, human rights organizations, parang that training geared towards media literacy and fact-checking seems to be, parang dati, diba, it was more of a remit of the journalists only to do this. So
Yes.
now what we're seeing is human rights organizations, civil society organizations, election advocacy groups seem to have more buy-in to media literacy and fact-checking efforts na parang mas nagiging widespread siya. It's a mandate that has become more normalized across civil society. And I think that's a good thing.
Yes.
What I hope happens as well is our government, our lawmakers are also supportive of media literacy efforts, are also supportive of investigative and deep research on the topic. So parang hindi lang ito parang pinapasa to the teachers, to the journalists or civil society, but there needs to be real investment in media literacy efforts, and also doing independent monitoring, independent research around disinformation networks. So parang palaging whenever there's a new scandal, policymakers seem to want to craft like a new law around it. But why don't they support the actual people who have been doing research and investigations and media literacy efforts around this, as opposed to just trying to unmask the troll. Na parang ganun pa din yung mindset ng
Right,
ating
right.
lawmakers, and I find that very disappointing.
Jonathan, what interventions have you seen in other parts of the world that fascinated you, that actually work?
That actually work? Yeah, a very good question. So, what some folks here in the United States have tried to innovate are what they call ano daw, inoculation videos, parang psychological inoculation videos. Kumbaga pre-bunking. So uunahan na nila yung disinformation or conspiracy theory. So parang you might see attempts or videos, for example, that will say that the election was stolen. And ito yung mga techniques and strategies nila. So bago pa kumalat yung narrative mismo, parang na-inoculate na nila, kumbaga na-vaccinate na nila yung masa to understanding and watching out for, okay, baka maging possible narrative ito for the next news cycle, and therefore they should know about it. So yung mga journalists, inuunahan, kumbaga, yung potential narratives. And I think that's one good possibility. Another...
Ang nauna kasi
yeah.
dito dyan, I mean, supposedly, politiko rin yung naunang gumamit na tactic na yan dito.
I agree with you, and I think that's one big challenge na we still have not held responsible the politicians and their main chief strategists, kumbaga, who actually design influence operations. Nandun pa rin tayo sa, let's unmask the fake account. Let's parang figure out, sino itong meme account operator na to na nagtutroll sa akin. The politicians always also see themselves as the victim of fake news na parang, na-troll kami, let's create a new law around it, di ba? But parang have they been reflexive enough na parang, wait a minute, parang should they be thinking about their own complicity to disinformation? The fact na they've been hiring a lot of advertising, PR strategists, and of course yung job nila is to attack other candidates, to dwell in that gray area of fake news and campaigning, di ba? So parang that to me is a whole area na wala pang enough discussions around, and politicians seem to be tiptoeing around that kahit sa mga Senate hearings natin. And I think in other countries, there's more discussion about it. Sa atin, parang wala. Parang we're still going around that idea. We still think of the troll na parang, the troll is in a troll farm up in Ilocos or down in Davao. Oh no, the troll farm is actually integrated in the PR firm in Metro Manila. This has become normal practice. Sideline gig ito ngayong election season ng maraming tao, but we don't seem to be talking about it in that way. Parang we often see, the troll is this parang far away and parang exotic creature, di ba? Let's try to unmask them. But no, it's become a normal practice.
But I mean, sorry, we're almost out of time, pero gusto ko lang sundutin yun. Am I getting you right that if we wanted accountability, we actually have enough information? We know which agency, which firms, kaya nating punteriyahin, nandyan yan sa itong headquarters niyan. And so, I mean, with a little more research and with a little more resources, it's actually not that hard to pinpoint at the base and therefore accountable people.
I would agree with you. I think there's no political will to hold them into real account. So it's an industry open secret that a lot of campaigns in influence operations are done in the corporate boardroom, in the respectable boardroom of an advertising or a public relations firm. That influencers don't operate in isolation, but influencer firms actually integrate influencers and coordinate influencers into strategic action, including for politicians. But we've only been asking them easy questions. Some of these people get invited to Senate hearings, but they're asked, very easy questions. And politicians are tiptoeing around these people. These are also powerful people. These are economic elites who control a lot of advertising money as well, diba? And I think that's what makes it very hard to create transparency mechanisms around this industry. Na parang they're so integrated into how our media landscape works. And I think we need more investigative research following the money trail and really assigning accountability to these people. And sana parang there's more willingness to talk about it and to create more transparency into the business of political campaigns.
Okay. Professor Jonathan Ong, who is researching disinformation, has developed a lot of expertise on finding out how disinformation works and hopefully how we can counter it. He's associated with Harvard University and the University of Massachusetts. Professor Ong, maraming salamat po.
Thank you, sir. Good morning.
Thank you, Professor.
And that will be all for this edition of the Chiefs, but we hope what was discussed here will keep the conversation going. Before we go, a reminder to our viewers, mask on, wash hands, stay safe, Philippines. I'm Robbie Alampay.
I'm Lucy Cruz Valdez of News 5.
I'm Ed Lingao, and we are One News.